Welcome, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Sisters in Crime Present Modern Heroine. And for those of you who may not know, Sisters in Crime is an international organization dedicated to the professional development and advancement of women crime writers. They have 60 chapters worldwide, and they welcome anyone who loves crime fiction. And I just wanted to share one quick note that I pulled from their website today, which I found was really compelling. In 1986, women wrote 40% of the mysteries and got 15% of the reviews in the New York Times. Sisters in Crime was founded to combat discrimination against women in the mystery field, to raise awareness of the contributions of female authors, and to promote the professional advancement of women who write mysteries. So it's our pleasure to have you here tonight. This program was sponsored by the Friends of the Library. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guests. Lisa Lieberman is the president of the New England chapter of Sisters in Crime. She writes the Kara Walden series of historical mysteries based on old movies and featuring blacklisted Hollywood people on the lam in dangerous international locales. Her books hit the sweet spot between Casablanca and John le Carré. All the Wrong Places, Burning Cold, and The Glass Forest are available wherever books are sold and the library. Trained as a modern European cultural and intellectual historian, Lieberman abandoned a perfectly respectable academic career for the life of a vicarious adventurer through perilous times. She has written extensively on post-war Europe and lectures locally on efforts to come to terms with the trauma of the Holocaust, or not, in film and literature. On the lighter side, she talks about books and movies and leads writing workshops at public libraries and literary festivals throughout New England. Tilia Klebenov Jacobs is the best-selling author of 2 crime novels, 1 middle grade fantasy book, and numerous short stories. She is a judge in San Francisco's Soul-Making Keats Literary Competition, a reviewer for the IndieReader.com, and a board member of the Mystery Writers of America, New England. HarperCollins describes her as one of crime fiction's top authors. Tilia has taught middle school, high school, and college, as well as writing classes for prison inmates. She lives near Boston with her husband, 2 children, and a pleasantly neurotic standard poodle. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. And one of the things that we're hoping, which will make this special, and it feels like everyone has honored that, is we're gonna have everyone's microphones and cameras off until the end of the program. If you have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can try to answer them as best as we can at the end of the program. And then after that, we can open it up for people to ask any questions. This program will be recorded and will be on the library's website probably later this week or maybe early next week. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lisa and Tilia. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, and thank the Friends of the Library as well. Sisters in Crime has had the great pleasure of presenting programs to you all before, and it's always a wonderful experience. Your readers are so articulate, they give us a run for our money. And we're expecting no less tonight. So I'm going to be sharing my screen here. I've made a little slideshow presentation, and Tilia and I will be speaking and sometimes disagreeing about many of the women authors who have inspired us. And as you will see from my screen, which I need to start playing.
You go to play, that should
Here
make
we
it
are.
full screen.
Yep.
There we go.
As you can see from my screen, our sort of theme of this program is a phrase of Tilia's, "Back then, women did." And I'm going to let Tilia explain what she means by that.
Well, apparently I really cut loose in an email to Lisa about this when we were first putting the program together. But this is a pet peeve of mine, because very often people will say, they will point to somebody they really admire who is a modern person, I don't know, Reese Witherspoon, let's say, and say, oh, look at her, she's an actress and she's an entrepreneur and she's, produces all of these wonderful stories. And then they say, but, back in the 50s, that wouldn't have been possible. Back then, women didn't. Back then, women didn't, blah, 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 fill in the blank. And the problem with this is, well, it's twofold. Number one, with those 4 words, back then women didn't, what you're doing is erasing centuries of female achievement. Because pretty much without exception, whenever somebody says back then women didn't, a little bit of digging will turn up plenty of examples of women who did. And the other problem is that, so it's not accurate, it's also insulting. And we need to know where we came from in order to celebrate the past and stand on the shoulders of the giants who got us where we are today.
And what you'll find in this talk that we've put together is that the modern mystery heroine actually emerged during the Victorian era. So all those women who you think of as wearing tight corsets and fainting and being unable to take care of themselves really don't give you the whole picture of what that age was about. And the first woman author who has been called the mother of the modern detective novel was a woman by the name of Anna Katharine Green. She's an American. She lived from 1846 to 1935. And she created 2 very influential heroines. The first one, Amelia Butterworth, was described as a nosy society spinster who solved crimes. And I think you can all guess who she reminds you of. The second one, Violet Strange, was a debutante with a secret life. And you can read from that little excerpt a little bit about her. She was, a very well-bred young woman who was bored and solved crimes and, was nobody's fool.
And before we go on, I would just like to say that although, Edgar Allan Poe is often said to be the person who pretty much invented the modern detective genre. He wrote Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. So that was the first detective story by an American author, but the first detective novel was in fact the work of Anna Katharine Green. And in fact, for those of you who might not know this little bit of literary history, the early novels were mostly written by women. It was a female genre.
She also published a series of novels featuring a male detective. The first one was called The Leavenworth Case. It came out 9 years before the Sherlock Holmes series by Arthur Conan Doyle. So little known today, but pretty influential in her time.
So The Leavenworth Case it's a detective story, and a lot of critics feel that the actual detective, whose name is Ebenezer Gryce, which may have sounded a lot sexier back in 1878, he isn't apparently much of a presence in the narrative, but he is quite memorable when he does show up on the page. And he also manages to stay several steps ahead of the narrator, who is a young lawyer who takes it upon himself to assist in the investigation of the murder of the wealthy Horatio Leavenworth. And it gets very complicated because a large part of his motivation is that he wants to exonerate the beautiful but possibly murderous niece of the deceased. And as Lisa said, this book predates both Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie. And it's a very worthwhile read because we get to see how Green's novel, which was a bestseller in its time, influenced the mystery genre as it came of age.
I'm going to talk about the next slide, and I'm going to ask Marita if she can do anything to perhaps make me stop being a host for a minute so that I can get out of this screen and then start sharing my screen again. But while Marita's trying to do that, I'm going to start talking about the next slide, which hopefully will come up again. And that's a slide of Wilkie Collins, who is a male author who created a memorable female heroine by the name of Marion Halcombe, who is my favorite mystery character in 19th century fiction. And she is so incredible because she is not at all a fading violet. She's a very strong-willed. So here's Marion Halcombe, who is a very strong woman. And as you can see from this quotation here, she is not, frail. She is not weak. She is not pretty. She is very dark in terms of her coloring. And she's described by one of the male characters in the book as ugly. Nevertheless, I think the thing about her that's so fascinating.
We're actually hopping back in time just a little bit, because The Woman in White, which was Wilkie Collins' fifth published novel, was written in 1859. And so it's considered to be one of the first mystery novels and possibly one of the finest in the subgenre of sensation novels. And the nub of it is that the protagonist, whose name is Walter Hartright, because this is a Victorian novel we're talking about, employs a lot of the sleuthing techniques of later private detectives. There are multiple narrators. So sorry about that. With any luck, somebody will pick that up. It draws on Wilkie Collins' legal training. Do I remember correctly? He was a lawyer, Lisa?
I don't know if he ever practiced as one, but I suspect that he started his education as a lawyer.
Right. I think that is right. A lot of, I can think of a fair number of former lawyers who become mystery writers. And I think it's because, not only because they are accustomed to looking at crimes, but they're also accustomed to putting a narrative together.
It's important, I think, to recognize a point that is going to become a theme of this program, which is that unconventional heroines like Marion Halcombe were created by unconventional people. Mm-hmm. And Wilkie Collins was nothing if not an unconventional man for his age. That quotation that I have at the top here, only give a woman love and there's nothing she will not venture, suffer, and do. Well, he knew this firsthand because he loved two women. And the first one whom he married was a woman by the name of Caroline Graves. And she had a child from an earlier marriage, which he raised as his own. But then he met another young woman whose name was Martha Rudd. And she was working class. His wife was more educated. And he began to live with her simultaneously. He maintained two households. And when he was living with Martha, he called himself William Dawson. And he and Martha had 3 children. But then he would go back to his wife. And, he was a very good father. But, in addition to this rather unconventional lifestyle, he also hung out with unconventional people. He was friends with a man by the name of Walter Besant. And Walter was the brother of a woman named Annie Besant, who was an early advocate for birth control. She was in favor of poor relief. She was a member of the Fabian Society, which was a socialist organization that believed in gradual change rather than revolution. She later became an advocate of Indian self-rule. And then some feel she kind of went off the deep edge because she began to believe in, she was a founder of a movement called Theosophy that believed that, the Buddha was reincarnated in India, and she found the young man who she believed was the reincarnated Buddha, a man by the name of Krishnamurti. And some of you may know that Krishnamurti became the founder of a movement, a spiritual movement in Southern California, and that a number of prominent actors and philosophers, people like Aldous Huxley, kind of passed through this movement. So, Collins hung out with, I guess we call them, some of the bohemians of his day. But, he was a feminist. I think, before feminism was really a concept, he was somebody who truly believed that women were every bit as good as men. And he created these unconventional women heroines who solved crimes, weren't afraid, consorted with men as equals. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. Before we get into the classic era, which has many of the novelists that I think we all cut our eye teeth on, I want to talk about the true birth of the feminist movement on both sides of the Atlantic, because Collins was sort of a harbinger within his own culture of that. But on our side of the Atlantic, the Seven Sisters were all founded before 1889. There was a strong movement for women's rights. The women's suffrage movement, I didn't know this, but it actually started in 1840 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott, who was a Black woman who was active in the Underground Railroad. And the two of them together called for votes for women. From Lucretia Mott's point of view, the only way that Black men might get justice in her society, and this is before the Civil War, was if Black women could help lift them up.
I need to add to that, by
Please.
the way. Okay, first of all, Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't go to the Seven Sisters because they hadn't been founded yet. She went to my alma mater, Oberlin College, 1833. Thank you very much. And Oberlin was not only granting bachelor's degrees to women alongside of men. In the 1830s, they were also giving college degrees to Black women decades before the Civil War. And in fact, you alluded to this, the push for women's rights was absolutely went hand in glove with the push for Black emancipation too. It was the same group of people. And the women who were pushing really hard for freedom for the enslaved people were also pushing for women's rights. And you mentioned that the women's movement officially started in 1840. I believe it was in 1848 that the Seneca Falls Convention was held. And one of the headliners there was Frederick Douglass, who very much believed that freedom was freedom. And there was a huge push for women's rights at that time. It took a big backseat after the war and came, for various reasons we won't go into, but it came roaring back in the 1890s, which is when a lot of the people we're going to be talking about now were either born at that time or educated at that time. It was a time of tremendous social agitation. Yes, and it was also in America. It was the era of the progressives who were, being concerned about a lot of issues, including safety, health and safety in industries like the meatpacking industry. But in Britain, it was a time of the radical suffragist movement, where you had women like Emmeline Pankhurst, who was, an early, advocate of votes for women in Britain, who was willing to use violent means in order to get her, her goals accomplished. And she would chain herself to fences. There were, riots. They would disrupt events such as, processions of the royalty in Britain at that time. And there were criticisms of the suffragists that compared them to Amazons because of their willingness to use violence. And I just want you to keep this in mind because we will return to this later. Go
But
Anne.
now I can properly introduce Dorothy Sayers, who lived from 1893 to 1957, who attended Somerville College, which was the first college for women at Oxford University, and she studied classics there. And the novel Gaudy Night, which I think most of us are familiar with, is all about women's education and questioning whether a woman who got an education, was a dangerous thing. So you know where that came from. Tilia, do you have anything to add to Dorothy Sayers?
Yeah, this actually ties in with our whole theme that back then women didn't. I get very annoyed when people point to somebody like Sayers or like any of the other people we'll be discussing and say, oh, she was so remarkable for her time. Because anytime that you say somebody is unique, you're obliterating all the people around her who are just as intelligent, hardworking, and high achieving and worthy of our attention. So Dorothy Sayers didn't feel that her best work was her crime novels. The thing that she was proudest of was her translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, which is still to this day very, very highly regarded. And she unexpectedly died of a heart attack on the 17th of December in 1957 while she was engaged in translating Dante's third volume, Paradiso. So it was left unfinished, and her friend, Dr. Barbara Reynolds, completed her work. And I know nothing about Dr. Reynolds other than that, but it's really important to notice that, yeah, there were other women who were as educated, as dedicated, and as skilled in a particularly tricky bit of translation as Dorothy Sayers.
Now I want you just to remark on the cover of Strong Poison, which is not the original cover of that book. Strong Poison came out, I believe, in 1930. And that was the first novel that introduced Harriet Vane, who became a fine partner for Lord Peter Wimsey, who was her first detective hero. But just keep your eye on that cover, which
it's hard to look away, isn't it?
Yes, it was. This is the cover that was given to Strong Poison in the 1950s. And again, we will be coming back to this. But let me move on to, I think many people were first introduced to the mystery genre by Agatha Christie. I know I was. And the cover of They Do It With Mirrors is, the original cover from that book. Agatha Christie, as I'm sure many of you know, was married to an archaeologist, and you can see her on a camel there when they were traveling in Egypt for his work. But maybe what you don't know is that even before she married the archaeologist, which was her second marriage, she was another unconventional woman. She was born in the 1890s. She lived until 1976. In World War I, she volunteered to work in a hospital dispensary, and that's where she acquired her knowledge of poisons, which she was put to good use later on. Her first marriage, which was not a happy one, she married a man named Archie Christie, was nonetheless a very adventuresome one. And Archie took her many places, including Waikiki, where she and he were some of the first people to surf standing up. So Agatha, was an adventuresome woman who, in her own right, really saw quite a bit of the world, at a time when it wasn't so easy to travel, and she wasn't afraid to take risks. Anything you want to add on Dame Agatha?
Yeah, sure. Just that I really want everybody to know that she is the best-selling novelist of all time. So you can stack that up next to, Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or Leslie Charteris or any of those. And yeah, they all come in I was going to say a distant second, but they can't all be second. You know what I mean? And to give you an idea of her output, she wrote 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections. And she also wrote the world's longest running play, The Mousetrap, which I think might still be playing on the West End.
And our final person from the classic era, who I'm sure many of us here also were introduced to at a young age, is Mildred Wirt Benson, who used the pseudonym Carolyn Keene and wrote the Nancy Drew novels. And that's the original cover of the first one, The Secret of the Old Clock. She lived from 1905 to 2002, and she attended the University of Iowa. She studied journalism, and she continued working as a journalist, even while churning out the Nancy Drew novels and other novels into her 90s. Mm. And that's her on the motorcycle with her husband. She was another adventurer. She has him in the sidecar, and she traveled to Central America. She rafted on the Amazon. In South America, she rode jeeps through the jungles. You know, this is another person who was pretty intrepid. And I always found Nancy Drew pretty intrepid. I never knew what a roadster was, but other than that, I enjoyed the novels.
Yeah, I was more into the Hardy Boys myself. But that being said, I did not realize until pretty recently how important Nancy Drew has been to a whole lot of people, not just in our circle of mystery writers, but I'm going to list a bunch of people who all list Nancy Drew as having been a formative influence on them. Sandra Day O'Connor, Sonia Sotomayor, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and former First Lady Laura Bush.
Wow, that's nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's move into the war years and Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman is, obviously a strong woman, and there's the Amazon coming to the fore. This is a woman who knows how to fight. She's, very, very courageous, and her founder, her creator, a man by the name of William Moulton Marston, is, another feminist. And if you read what he says, women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weakness. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strength of Superman, plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman. And what I like about this statement is that Wonder Woman is not just like Superman, in sort of scanty clothes with, the bracelets and the boots. She is a woman. She doesn't stop being a woman, and she brings compassion and decency to her stories. And I admire that about her. I used to read the comic books as a kid, and I liked her. But Marston, want to get into some unconventional life. He was a believer not only in free love and polygamy, but he was into some fairly kinky sex and some of the themes that you can see even in that picture, with the lasso and the bracelets and, the way she's dressed, seems to be the kind of sex that he enjoyed to practice. He had a wife who he loved very much, and she was an independent career woman. Her name was Sadie Holloway. She attended Mount Holyoke, but he also has a mistress. She's the one on his shoulder in the right, and he met her while she was a student at Tufts, where he was teaching, and she was helping him on some of his somewhat kinky research, and they became involved. He brought her into the household, and all those children you see in the picture are either from his, relationship with his wife or his relationship with Sadie. Now, Sadie, his wife was Sadie. His mistress was Olive Byrne. Olive Byrne was the daughter of Ethel Byrne. Ethel Byrne was a close friend of Margaret Sanger. Together, Ethel Byrne and Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood. So, again, William Moulton Marston, like Wilkie Collins, is moving in, very progressive circles, and is really strongly in favor of women's rights. In fact, I just discovered this today. He was a student at Harvard in 1911, and his debating club at Harvard invited Emmeline Pankhurst to speak. So, this is a guy who, really truly believed in equal rights for women. And Pankhurst was not allowed to speak there, by the way. Harvard thought that would be too dangerous. So they found some other location, on Brattle Street in Cambridge, and they had her speak there.
I'd like to add a couple of things. It's true that the iconography of Wonder Woman and the early, she has a lasso, and especially the early stories often had her being chained up. And there's a couple of different ways that we can read this. And I, by the way, I don't think either of them cancels out the other. It is true that in his private life, Marston was into bondage. However, I really almost hesitate to go down that route, because I feel that what consenting adults do in the privacy of their own bedroom is their business and nobody else's. And, does that carry over into his depiction of Wonder Woman with the lasso and the chains and everything? Yeah, maybe, but he was also the inventor of the lie detector. And what does Wonder Woman's lasso do? It is the lasso of truth. If she gets that around you, then you are compelled to tell the truth. And as for the chains, those were a big symbol in the women's movement at that time, and the women's suffrage movement in the generation before. Women would chain themselves to the fence outside of the White House to demand the right to vote. Women would march for their rights, carrying or wearing chains to show, the oppression that they were bound to break out of. And just like them, Wonder Woman always breaks free of whatever is holding her down. And I actually have more to say about that, but did you want to continue? Because I can come back.
Well, I just wanted to point out how inspiring Wonder Woman was. That cover is the first Ms. magazine that came out, and they chose to use her on their cover. Jill Lepore wrote a wonderful book about this, and I recommend it if you want to know more about this. But she's the first person who brought to my attention the points that Tilia is making about how closely tied in Wonder Woman was to all of those earlier campaigns, feminism, birth control, etc., that started before the First World War. Sadly, I think that, the World War II was kind of like the climax of the strong woman heroine whose odyssey we've been tracing since the Victorian era. And after the war, there was kind of a retrograde movement.
I'm sorry, can we go back just a quick?
Sure.
I wanted to say just something quick about Wonder Woman. Marston actually invented her as sort of a counterbalance to the male superheroes who he saw. He thought that we didn't have the term toxic masculinity then. He called it blood-curdling masculinity. That's what he saw in comic books. And he thought Superman looked like a fascist to a lot of people. He overpowers everybody, and is it really healthy to have little boys or children generally worshiping somebody like that? And so he went to one of the early comic book publishers. This is when comic books were still a fairly new genre. The guy's name was Gaines. And he said, look, if you had a female superhero, her powers could all be about love and truth and beauty. And you could also sell your comic books better to girls. And that would be really important and great, because she could show girls that they could do anything.
Nice.
And I have to say that the first modern Wonder Woman movie that came out just a few years ago with Gal Gadot in the lead role, also directed by Patty Jenkins, one of the few female directors in Hollywood, absolutely nailed that aspect of Wonder Woman. And if you haven't seen it, I really recommend it, even if you're not terribly into superhero movies. There's a scene where she's running across no man's land during World War I. Makes me cry every single time because she is so powerful, and her power is about love and justice and loyalty. And it's just gorgeous.
That's really nice. Well, now we'll get to sort of the retro movement. I mean, you all know that when World War II ended, women who had entered the workforce were encouraged to go back and take care of their homes. And the novel Laura, which was written by Vera Caspary, what happened to it when Hollywood got hold of it, I think really epitomizes this retro movement I'm talking about. Vera Caspary, who lived from 1899 to 1987, was a very progressive-minded woman who was in Greenwich Village. She never was very political, but she had a very strong social conscience. And she worked in the advertising industry. She did everything she could to make ends meet. Her background was very modest. But one of the things she wrote before she wrote this noir classic Laura was a novel called White Girl, which came out in 1929, the same year as Nella Larsen's passing. And it's about a Black woman who tries to pass as white and what happens to her. And she sets it in Chicago, which is where Caspary was born. And it was very well reviewed in the Black newspaper of Chicago. And she herself was, her politics were very progressive, as I said.
She was a communist.
Well, she really wasn't. She hung out with those people, but she herself, moved away from it very quickly.
She did. That's true. And she only joined under an alias.
That's true also. But when she wrote Laura, which was in 1941, she wrote this story from multiple points of view, just like Wilkie Collins's Woman in White. And so Laura gets to narrate her own story in the book. And, first we see her from the point of view of male characters, but then we get to see how she views herself. And that quotation I put in, I had used him as women use men to complete the design of a full life, playing at love for the gratification of my vanity, wearing him proudly as a successful prostitute wears her silver foxes to tell the world she owns a man. This is a woman who is very open about the fact that she enjoys sex, that she chose a man because he was good looking and she wanted to, have him on her arm, and that she realizes that she emasculated him. And that side of her, she's not happy about that. She really takes a good hard look at herself. But that side of her does not come out in the movie. And I included a still from the movie with Dana Andrews and Clifton Webb, where they're pointing at the picture of Laura. Because in the movie, all you see is the way that men in Laura's life viewed her. You don't get any sense of her own point of view. And I love the movie. I love Gene Tierney. But what they did to Caspary's book was they took all of the complexity out of it, and they turned her into just an object of desire. And this is the trend that I'm going to trace now in post-war noir. There were some wonderful noir novels being written by women at this time. My favorite is The Blank Wall by Elizabeth Sanchez Holding. She was born in 1889 and died in 1955. She wrote 18 detective novels. Raymond Chandler called her the top suspense writer of them all. And in this one, The Blank Wall, which came out in 1946, it's set during World War II. And the idea is that a very nice housewife and mother who married to be taken care of is suddenly forced to take care of her family because her husband is off at war. And, not the sort of scanty attire notwithstanding on the cover, the character of Lucia is a very strong and complex woman. And in the course of having to cover up a murder which was accidentally committed, but she's afraid that her family will be blamed, she comes to see the world differently. She grows up. She has her eyes opened. She recognizes that her Black housekeeper, for example, is a person who she's never seen as a full human being. And now she comes to rely on her. And the two of them, really are the strong women at the center of this novel. And by the end of the book, she realizes that she's got to go back and be the sweet, innocent thing that her husband wanted, because he's off in the Pacific. He's suffering in the war. And he's writing to her and saying, "Oh, I can't wait to come home to you. And, you silly little thing, don't you worry, I'll take care of you again." And at the very end of the book, I won't tell you what happens in the book, but she recognizes how easy it is to just let the leaves cover this all over and pretend. And that's what she's going to do. It's really a very strong work and very critical of the post-war society. But when it was made into a movie, and it's a wonderful movie, Joan Bennett and James Mason are superb in this movie. But again, that complexity is gone. And Joan Bennett's character is much more of a traditional femme fatale. And, you see that James Mason gets top billing, even though he's not the main character. Joan Bennett's character is. So it's a change that sadly, happened in noir. And if I can just take you back for 1 second to that, poster, that cover from the 1950s of, Dorothy Sayers' novel, what you're supposed to focus on there is, her attire and her breasts, not, anything else. The pulpy side of, that novel is suddenly being advertised, and that's what they're marketing, not the intelligent woman who said she resented the way in which he, meaning Lord Peter, walked in and out of her mind as if it was his own flat. This woman, you're not thinking about her mind, if you know what I mean. All right, well, on to the 60s.
Well, actually, I just want, in case anyone is unfamiliar, sure, just one click if we could, just in case anyone is unfamiliar with a couple of noir conventions. Noir was, if you think of 1940s and early 50s crime dramas, they were usually black and white. They had a lot of atmosphere to them, and a lot of the through line emotionally of the story had to do not so much with overt violence, but with the threat of violence. It was about menace and suspense. And you mentioned femme fatale, which I usually translate as lethal lady. You could also say double-crossing dame. She's the one who uses sex and sexuality to trap, maim, and sometimes murder one of the men, often the one we're rooting for. And so these are very reliable conventions in film noir.
It's very true. I'm going to jump to the 60s now. And my favorite of all 1960s, even 1970s television heroines, because I was actually watching these shows in reruns when I was in junior high and high school, is Emma Peel, the wonderful Diana Rigg, who, besides looking great in a cat suit, she could flip a man over her shoulder, but she could also engage in intelligent repartee with her colleague, John Steed. I found her so inspiring, and that's because there weren't a lot of other role models. And Tilia is going to disagree with me here on some of these, but these were the other television shows that were available to me as a girl growing up in the 1960s, or movies. And you have Pussy Galore and James Bond. You have The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., which only lasted one season. You have Batgirl, which only lasted one season. You have Honey West, which only lasted one season, and which seemed to be more about marketing, dolls and lunchboxes than about the actual series. And then, a notch up, definitely a notch up, you had Get Smart and Barbara Feldman, who, had to play second fiddle to Max. And you had Barbara Bain, who was cool, calm, collected, and beautiful, but didn't have much of a role to play in Mission Impossible. So now Tilia is going to disagree with me.
Well, somewhat. I mean, first of all, I'm not going to ask you to click back, but in terms of the Avengers, the 1960s spy show, I was wondering, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, if you can sort of draw a line between Emma Peel in her tossing guys over her shoulder while wearing her black catsuit and the character of Black Widow in the superhero franchise, The Avengers, also wears a black catsuit and also tosses guys around as if they were rag dolls. And I don't know if there's really a yes or no answer to that, but it sure is fun to think about. And actually, I do think there's a lot of overlap. So going around these pictures, going clockwise from the upper left, could not agree with you more about James Bond, and especially this iteration of James Bond. I think that Sean Connery's approach to the character was to make him out to be just a particularly vile sadist. He just looks like somebody who hurts people and enjoys himself doing it. The character of Pussy Galore, I don't think we need to explain what's wrong with that. The girl from Uncle and Honey West, I'm honestly not familiar with. I know the man from Uncle was much more successful. Maybe the reason Honey West failed was because they thought they could just sell the toys and the merchandise and didn't bother coming up with a decent character. Heaven knows that happens. Batgirl, I like Batgirl. She's a really fun character. She was a spin-off from Batman. One of the things that I love about her on the Batman show is that when you see her fighting, almost all the time she uses her lower body. She uses her legs. And this, I realize that the producers were not striving for hyper-realism in these fight scenes or any other aspect of Batman. But the fact is that this is a better way for women to fight. If you are, God forbid, ever in an actual physical altercation with a man, you're not going to win in an upper body fight. It's much better to drop to the ground and use your legs and start kicking because you're just stronger that way. And whether it was by accident or design, I couldn't say. But whereas Batman and Robin fight with their fists, 99% of the time, she fights with her legs. And Barbara Felton makes Get Smart. She's a straight man. Well, first of all, she's a whole lot smarter than, Maxwell Smart, which admittedly is not saying a whole lot, but she's the one who always knows what's going on. She always is the one who says, but Max, what about thus and such? And then he decides that she's right. And she's also the straight man to his funny guy. And a funny guy just isn't that funny without a straight man. And I think she did what a lot of these actresses had to do, and let's give them credit for this, is make an entire character out of some very lean writing.
Well, I just look at other teams at this time, like, you had Stella and Mira, and, she and Mira could be equal to Jerry Stiller. So, I think there were alternatives, and that, sort of TV land chose not to do the full thing that they could have done if you want a team where somebody is the straight man. So it just troubled me. I liked Barbara Feldman as an actress. I thought she was very good, but as a young girl growing up, and this is what I had on TV.
There wasn't a lot to identify with.
That's the problem. But let me go on, because we are moving on, and say that there were some wonderful new authors coming out in the 60s who were creating an alternative, and pretty much in the Sayers and Christie tradition. One of them was Carolyn Heilbrunn, an academic who was actually the first woman to earn tenure in the English department at Columbia, who wrote the Amanda Cross, under the name of Amanda Cross. She wrote about Kate Fansler, and her novels were very critical of, the male-dominated academic world that Heilbrunn lived in, which I guess is why she used a pseudonym. And the other, Tilia's favorite, Dorothy Gilman, who created Emily Polifax, and I'm going to let her talk about that.
So Mrs. Polifax is a little old lady, and she's a widow in the first book and an empty nester, and she's active in the garden club. And in her spare time, she's an undercover agent for the CIA. And these books are just delightful. And I also want to put in a word for the audio versions, which are narrated by a really wonderful reader. I think her name is Barbara Rosenblatt. And but they're just tremendous fun.
And that's Angela Lansbury, who played her in a television series. So you really can't go wrong with Mrs. Polifax.
That's true. You really can't. And in fact, when Dorothy Gilman died in 2012, her obituary in the New York Times noticed that Emily Polifax was probably the only spy in literature to belong simultaneously to the CIA and the local garden club.
So that's a charming one. And if you don't know it, I encourage you to look for those books.
And fun fact, I gave one of those books to my aunt for her birthday one year because she herself had been an undercover agent for the CIA in the 1950s.
Wow. Yep. That is a fun fact.
Back when women didn't.
All right. Well, the last slide that we have is the 70s, which, again, was not a stellar era as far as the, women detective was concerned. I watched the Mod Squad. I was disappointed in Peggy Lipton's character. Scooby-Doo, well, I happen to like Velma more than Daphne, and as cartoons go, I think it was a more clever cartoon than many. But Charlie's Angels was the one that really troubled me. I mean, I was in college by the time that came out, and I wasn't so happy with the portrayal of, these three women detectives, where it seemed it was more important, what they wore and how much of their bodies they showed than, the crime solving. But again, Tilia is going to disagree with
I totally disagree. And Lisa and I are never going to agree on this. Okay, so are they in sexy clothes with a ton of makeup and high heels? Yes, absolutely. Let's look now at what they're doing. If you've ever seen the original Charlie's Angels, you'll know that the opening montage with a voiceover, shows the three of them going through the police academy and then thinking that they were going to be cops and discovering that they were, every single one of them, shoved off to the side because they were women. So one of them is a crossing guard, and one of them is doing paperwork, and one of them is sticking signs on cars next to expired meters. And then the voiceover says, but then I took them away from that. I'm Charlie and they work for me. Charlie is this faceless, disembodied voice who runs the Townsend Detective Agency. And in every show, he describes a case, a situation, and the angels then take over. And by the way, so two things about this. Again, I need to say we never see Charlie. We sometimes see like the back of his head or hand or something like that. We never see his face. There is a guy in the office named Bosley, but he's a bumbler. He often needs to be rescued. And the producers, Aaron Spelling was a producer, and at the time, he was told that women couldn't carry an hour-long drama. Like, it was okay for them to be in sitcoms or half-hour things, but they couldn't carry an hour-long drama. And so he decided to show that, in fact, they could. And the producers made a conscious decision that Charlie would never tell the angels what to do. He would tell them that something was going on, And then they would decide, there's nobody in the background, ignore that. They would decide how to solve the case. So it'd be, Sabrina, why don't you go down to the docks while Kelly and I will, talk to widow Schlabotnik and just see when her husband was last seen. They never need to be rescued. They always get their guy. They never fight with each other. There's never any competition among them. And they certainly never fight over a man. And as far as everybody at the time was told that this was jiggle TV, for one thing, all of the women have said on record that they wore bras at the time. But look, so we have somebody or a trio of somebodies who are hyper feminine, chasing the bad guys and winning. All right. So if you have somebody who is wearing all the latest clothing styles and driving a fancy car and winning against the bad guy, and that person's name is James Bond, then how come nobody says that that's denigrating to men? And this, the actresses at the time got, I almost said emails, they got letters from girls who were watching the show saying, I now realize that I don't just have to be a secretary or a teacher. Oh, by the way, speaking of somebody who has been a secretary and a teacher, there's nothing wrong with either of those things. The only problem is if you think that's the only thing you can do. So I just don't think that feminism has to be humorless or androgynous. I think it can come in many flavors. And in its own high fashion, heavily made up, high-heeled way, yes, I think this was a very deliberately feminist statement. And for whatever it's worth, the 2019 Charlie's Angels movie was directed by Elizabeth Banks. And as I believe we've mentioned already, there are very few female directors in Hollywood.
That's true.
So this was a platform for one of them.
Well, Tilia and I had a great time assembling these different stories and, heroes and writers for you. And we had a great time finding out where we agreed and where we disagreed. One of the things we realized we have in common has to do with the books that we are going to talk about briefly tonight. We sort of got the titles the same, and I think our approach to heroines is very similar. I'm going to let Tilia tell you about Wrong Place, Wrong Time.
So thank you. Wrong Place, Wrong Time was my first book. And as first books, I think always are, it was very much a labor of love. And a big part of my goal with writing Wrong Place, Wrong Time was to create a funny, smart, tough Jewish woman who might conceivably live next door to me. And by which I mean in modern culture, there are broadly speaking two kinds of Jewish characters, either Woody Allen neurotics or Holocaust victims. And I wanted somebody, as I said, who was more alive to me, who I could imagine running into and talking about what our kids were doing. So, but of course, or I should say, and of course, when you have a good character to make a good story, you've got to get them in trouble. Or as Eleanor Roosevelt said, a woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong it is until it's in hot water. Mm-hmm. So I will just read the back of the book for you, the blurb. When Sarah Edelman leaves her husband and two young children for a weekend to visit her estranged uncle, she little dreams he is holding several local children captive on his lavish estate. Mike Westbrook, father of one of the boys, kidnaps her to trade her life for the children's. Soon, Sarah and Mike are fleeing through New Hampshire's mountain wilderness, pursued by two rogue cops with murder on their minds.
Wow. That's a pretty gripping teaser that you've given us there. I don't know if I can top it, but I'll tell you about my inspiration. I love old movies, I love noir, but I wanted to create a heroine who wasn't your average dick. And I created a young woman who, this was also my first mystery, who, is 17 when the novel begins. She's just given away her her newly born child because she wasn't married. And when the novel really starts, she and her brother, who's a blacklisted screenwriter, have arrived in London just in time for Coronation Day. And she's very naive. She thinks she's tough. You know, she wants to look older than she is, but she's really very naive. And in the course of the novel, she needs to grow up. And part of what she needs to do is to understand her mother had committed suicide in the 1940s when she was just 10. And she needs to understand her mother as an adult in order to understand what happened to her. So the mystery at the heart of that story is one that Kara can only solve as she comes of age. And I was really inspired, as you can probably tell from what I talked about, by the women noir writers and their complex characters who had a conscience, who were self-critical, who learned in the course of what they were doing, but who were still compassionate, decent human beings as they went through and solved the crime. So I think I'm going to stop my screen share now, and we can let all of you, ask questions or talk, so you can turn on all your cameras again. And
yes, please do. It'd be so nice to see people again.
You guys, that was great. I mean, the stories and the characters.
Thank you.
Were new to me. I didn't know a lot of this, so I appreciate you educating us.
Well, if you haven't read some of these novels, you're in for such a treat. I wish I had some of them to read again for the first time.
Yeah.
So you have any questions for us?
I don't see anything in the chat, so if anyone
did Kit have a hand up a second ago, or was that?
Oh, please go. Yes.
So I was disappointed that you ended there. So what do you think of the 90s and into the new millennium?
Well, I will confess, we originally made this talk for Women's History Month, so that's why our emphasis is more on the past. But I would have to say, there was just such an explosion in the recent era, and there's been no shortage of fine women writers and fine heroines to choose from. I mean,
I'm sorry, go on.
Nope, you go.
Okay, so we actually talked about this a little bit today. Let's see where to begin. Before I tell you the characters who I'm loving now, I want to say that I think our task, all of us, is to make sure that these characters we talked about today and the authors we talked about today and the ones we're going to continue to talk about and create in our own lives as writers or appreciate as readers or viewers of movies, let's make sure that these people and their creations do not disappear, because one of my favorite sayings is the toilet of time is not often kind. Things just disappear. And, even things that that are very popular in their day, but it's especially true of women's creations. And I'm actually going to give a little example here. I'm renting a car that has one of those music streaming services hooked up to it. And one of my options was 70s rock. And it's one of those where you can, click through to the next song if you want to hear something different. Okay, 70s rock. I had to go through 85 songs before I came to a single female vocalist. Now, this was the 1970s when you had Linda Ronstadt, you had Carly Simon, you had Helen Reddy. Probably without question, one of the biggest and most influential albums of the entire decade was Tapestry, which is Carole King. And I finally got to something by Fleetwood Mac, and they had managed to find one of the only Fleetwood Mac songs where the guys were singing lead and the women were in backup. And this is what happens. And people say, oh, well, the algorithm. No, don't fall for it. Algorithms are not mushrooms. They do not occur naturally. Somebody programmed it. And whoever was behind that, it probably was not a, rub your hands and cackle attempt to sidestep every female rock artist in the 1970s, but it's unconscious bias. And this is the result. And so anyway, in answer to your question, Kit, the 90s, I'm actually going to hop over that and go straight to current day. And I hope you'll forgive me for doing that. But we were talking earlier about Wonder Woman, the recent Wonder Woman movie, not the second one, which really wasn't great, but the first one I thought was fantastic. And similarly, the Hunger Games franchise is written by a woman and has wall-to-wall strong female characters. It's not that there are no great male characters, there are, but it's a balanced world because there are both kinds of people in it. Sorry, shouldn't have said both. You know what I mean? Not trying to be too binary here. I will just say that a couple of times, first watching the Wonder Woman movie, but also watching certain scenes in the Hunger Games franchise, I remember just being brought to tears. Like there's a scene in, I've already mentioned my favorite scene in Wonder Woman, so I'll go to Hunger Games. There's a scene where the lead character, Katniss Everdeen, who is an archer, is practicing. She's training with her bow and arrow. She is so incredibly strong and athletic, and she's also wounded but lethal. And there is a montage training sequence that is so gorgeous, it makes me weepy. And part of why it makes me weepy is that, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. There was nothing like that on TV and in the movies. We did not have that depiction of female power. We had Dynasty, where women would slap each other and fall into a pool while wearing full evening attire. And so, I have a 16-year-old daughter. She gets to grow up with that as her cultural wallpaper. And God, it's a move in the right direction.
Any other questions from audience members? Well, maybe it's time to go.
We're a little delayed because the technology gods did not smile on us.
That's okay. Tilia and Lisa, you guys were wonderful. And this was a really great presentation. And I really appreciate you guys. And I appreciate everybody who attended tonight. This was really lovely. So
Yes,
thank you
so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you. And
people I
thanks
know
again
and people I don't.
To the library for giving us this opportunity to talk about our favorite books and movies.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. And I'll send out a message next week when the video is available.
Great.
Take care.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.